Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Venditti, and I'm going to talk to you about why rural areas are important and how the bioeconomy interacts with rural areas. So the learning objectives of our presentation today are first to understand what is a rural area, and then what are the benefits of those rural areas for society in the United States, and then what are the challenges of keeping rural areas sustainable and healthy. Okay, first let's just kind of talk about what we mean by a rural area. In general, what it means is that there's not a high density of population. And in fact, if you look at the Census Bureau, basically they have some numbers, like 1,000 people per square mile in the town, or 500 people per square mile or less in the surrounding areas. So what does that mean? When the Census Bureau goes ahead and does a population map, you can see that for this map, the highly populated areas are in red. So those are going to be our cities, and those are going to be our urban areas. In the map, in the green and yellow are the rural areas. So you can see that the United States has a majority of rural area, and the cities are somewhat scattered about in the country. Now here's the interesting thing. As that map showed, the green in that map, rural areas are about 97% of the nation's land area. So it's a huge dominant place. However, it only contains 19% of the population and 20% of the manufacturing. So we've got this very, very large area, rural area, and we have not a lot of people there. We'll talk more about why that's critical later. Okay, now let's just go back to maybe a little bit easier, simpler definition of rural areas, but that's important. A rural area is just an area of land that has few homes or buildings and not very many people. So that's not quantitative, but it's a qualitative description. In general, if you have a rural area, agriculture, which includes forestry and crops, is usually the primary industry. And then wildlife is prevalent and diverse in rural areas, more so than in urban settings like towns and cities. Okay, now I kind of want to step back. I'm just going to skip this slide. All right, now another nice thing to do when we're talking about and defining rural areas is to see pictures and images. So this first one right here is important because it shows, first of all, that the rural areas can have cropland, then they can have mountains and hills with forests, and there's also people that live within the rural area. And you can see here that it looks like there's a town centered around a road in the middle of the image. And basically that's an important part of it. People and the land are interacting, and that's important. But here you can see a lot of crop area. Here's another rural area, and this one you can see hills and a little stream or river and trees. And why I like to bring this one up is because the rural areas actually can filter and manage our water supply in some sense. In other words, they do a lot to help us purify water, store water, and transport water. So that's very important. When the rain falls on the forest or the soils, those forests and soils have a natural filtration and cleansing of the water. That's very important to society. All right, here's another rural area, and this is an aerial view of a forest. And here you don't see very many people or evidence of humans, but This is another very prevalent and very important type of rural area where it's heavily forested with trees. And of course, trees supply to society so much. And in our forest biomaterials department, we're big believers in all that. So that's what rural areas are. Now, why are rural areas important? To get started, we need to start to talk about what is an ecosystem and what is an ecosystem service. So basically, an ecosystem is a combination of living and non-living things that are interacting as an integrated system. So for example, we can think about, let's say, a lake. We've got living things, microorganisms, fish, birds. And then we have non-living things like water, minerals, air, oxygen, nitrogen. And so basically, a lake can be considered an ecosystem. And when we talk about ecosystem health and how an ecosystem behaves, we're very interested in how the living and non-living components all interact together in a system. Okay, so that's an ecosystem. Now let's talk about ecosystem services. Now, we know that society needs lots of things. We need materials, energy, air, water, things like that. And when we take from the environment, that is considered an ecosystem service. So basically, things that the environment supply to society and provide to humans that are important for us, our health and our good living, are called ecosystem services. So if we kind of break it down into some general categories, and the environment can provide to society food, water, and air. It can help us with our climate, regulate things, so it can control flow of water, absorption of pollution, how the wind and air changes. Another ecosystem service might be cultural, spiritual, and recreational benefits. And then there's the supporting category where the environment actually has different cycles, like the nutrient cycles that are used in soil, pollination to propagate plants, and just areas for wildlife to live. So all these things can be ecosystem services. And when society takes from the environment, it puts some pressures on the environment. And we hope that those pressures that we put on the environment are such that they don't irreversibly damage the environment. All right, so now we know about ecosystem services, and ecosystem services are really the broad umbrella term for the benefits that rural areas can bring to us. So when we think about rural areas where there's not a lot of population, we think about those areas as providing us food from crops that we plant and naturally harvested food. It provides us the water because a lot of the rainfall falls on the rural areas. Obviously, it's 97% of our land. And then oxygen. Oxygen is supplied by rural areas in the form of plants that take in carbon dioxide and they emit oxygen, which is a very important thing. So really, rural areas are the source of those three things that are extremely important to us. They're also the source of materials. So for instance, trees provide to us lumber, they provide to us chemicals, energy, paper, things like that. Another thing is that rural areas are usually the source of energy resources. So if we think about all energy resources, non-renewable and renewable, they all typically come from rural settings. That would include coal, ethanol, wind, solar, gas, oil, wood for burning. Also, rural areas filter and treat pollutants. So, of course, like let's say we have some rain, it might have some acid in it. That rain will hit trees, it will go into the soil. The soil will, because of some of the minerals in the soil, it will neutralize some of those acids. and then the water will seep or leak into lakes or rivers or go down mountainsides, and after it's been treated. So that's a very important part of what the rural areas or the environment can do for us. The other thing about rural areas is that there's space for animals, wildlife, and plants that probably can't survive in an urban setting are able to be healthy and be sustainable in rural areas. So that's very, very important. And then finally, rural areas provide us social benefits. So outdoor recreation in parks is a great example of that. That's a need that society has and that the rural areas are able to provide, whereas urban areas may not. Okay, so just kind of to summarize that, humans are a very special life form. We have a lot of demands, and we place them on ecosystems. And we take the ecosystem services, and this puts stresses on the ecosystems. So basically, to just kind of summarize, a majority of the society's needs are provided by ecosystems from rural areas. In other words, rural areas are key in providing our good quality of life. Here's just kind of an example of how a rural area can provide that ecosystem services and the urbans can. What we see here on the left is condensation or precipitation, rain, going into the forests and the soil, and it infiltrates the soil and then lower down into the groundwater, and then it actually slowly goes into our rivers and lakes, and then we use it. Society uses it for manufacturing, for drinking, for recreation, for all those things. And that rural area provides that nice ecosystem service. Now, if we contrast that to what's happening in the urban area, we have the rainfall, and that's going to hit a lot of impervious area, things like roads and parking lots and buildings, and it's going to run off very quickly. It's also going to collect and accumulate pollutants that we have from, let's say, automobiles or just other activities of society's life. And so that water is going to quickly run off and then go into the river. So you can see that if there's too much urban runoff of water and there's not enough rural treatment of the water, we're going to, as a society, have a problem. Our waterways are going to be polluted. And then that's happened quite a bit. So if you go around Manhattan, for instance, you do not want to be drinking right out of the Hudson River. So here's the thing. We understand that rural areas are extremely important and that we need to maintain those rural areas in order to get the ecosystem services in a sustainable way. Now, really, in order to have healthy rural areas, we have to have people in rural areas. And those people just can't be just any kind of people. Well, we do need a critical number of people, but we also need people with skills in land management, wildlife management, water management, all these kinds of things. And those people have to be working and living in rural areas in order to maintain health. We also need, in order to preserve rural areas, is that people that have jobs that can make a living off the land, that can actually live there and tend to some of the day-to-day things that are happening in rural areas. And then finally, we also need some people to support society in those rural areas, people like doctors and lawyers, and shopkeepers and transportation providers. So basically, we think about that rural area as an ecosystem. It includes the living people and then plants and animals, and also the non-living things like soils and water and air. And basically, that rural ecosystem is critical, and humans are a very important part of maintaining and keeping a nice, sustainable rural area. Okay? So the bottom line is if we want people there to help keep that rural area health good, we have to make life in rural areas appealing and rewarding to some people. Okay, so now we get to the challenges of rural areas, and the challenge is just kind of basically talking about what we need there. It is very difficult to recruit professionals to rural areas. So people like healthcare, legal, and education, we need those people there to make lives of rural people good, sustainable, and rewarding. And so is somewhat difficult to recruit professionals to those areas. We also need to have in the rural areas a certain amount of services and infrastructure, things like roads, entertainment, stores. That's also going to make life fulfilling for rural people. Another couple challenges are good education in rural areas. In general, there are lower levels of education. And then education goes along with quality of life. Higher education typically indicates, better choices in lifestyle decisions and things like that. And the last challenge is lower household incomes. To attract people to the rural areas, we need to have, sufficient incomes to have a good life, send kids to college, or pay doctor bills, or pay energy bills. And household incomes can challenge that too. So this example right here, graph right here, shows that the population changes on a year-to-year basis from 1976 to 2016. And what you see is that the orange line is the percent change from the previous year of people that are living in rural areas. And what you can see is that around 2010 or so, the growth rate in rural areas was 0 and seems to be negative for the last 4 or 5 years. If you contrast that to metro or urban areas in the blue, you can see that there's been a steady increase in the population in urban areas, around 0.8 to 1.4 or so percent change every year. So there's growth in the urban areas, and then there's a decline recently in the rural areas. This is not what we need for making a sustainable rural area. Okay, and then we also can see some data about, incomes. So incomes are important in people's lives, and people make decisions about where they're going to live and where they're going to work based on their potential income. And this graph just kind of shows that metro incomes around 2016 are around 61,000, whereas non-metro or rural income averages about 45,000 or so. So you can see that there's a pretty significant gap, $16,000 in actually the median household income between rural and urban. And this again is one of the challenges to attracting people to live in the rural areas. I also mentioned education, and this graph right here shows metro and non-metro, the distribution of people and at what education level they had gotten to. And so if we look at the 2015 data, what you'll notice is that in orange, dark orange at the top, 2015, people in cities, there was 33% of the people that had bachelor's degrees. And in 2015, for rural areas, it was only 19%. And you can kind of look down and see that in general, rural people have less education. And again, we feel like education is one of the keys to quality of life. Okay, so now what we want to do is say, okay, how does the bioeconomy fit into rural development? Okay, and former governor of Iowa and the agricultural secretary is quoted as saying that the bioeconomy is a catalyst for economic development in rural America. So it can create jobs and markets. And so what the point here is that if we can create jobs and wealth in rural areas, that will attract people to the rural areas, and those people are important in maintaining a sustainable and healthy rural area. And basically this graph right here just shows that the bioeconomy when we make bioproducts, bioenergy, things from our rural areas, that can create jobs. And this number right here specifies about 4.2 million jobs from the bioeconomy. And those jobs are mainly in rural areas. So we can see that the bioeconomy is a very important player in getting jobs and getting people into the rural environment. If you look at it, what this graph shows is that the darker areas have more bioeconomy jobs, and you can see that those are actually in many of the rural areas that we looked at when we looked at the population map earlier. And they're spread out pretty well, so that's important because we want to manage all kinds of rural areas, not just certain ones. Okay, now I'd like to just kind of summarize. First point that's really important is rural areas are important to the United States. They provide what's called ecosystem services that society really depends on to live. And some of these things are extremely critical, as you can imagine. Oxygen, water, clean air, these kinds of things. That's very, very important. And rural areas help us make those or provide those services. Okay? Now, the rural areas, in order to survive and to stay healthy and be sustainable, needs some certain amount of people to live and work in those areas. They can help manage things, make sure that the health of the rural areas are in check. And then finally, the bioeconomy and society's use of bioproducts and bioenergy are going to stimulate jobs and income and better education in those rural areas and provide a good lifestyle in those rural areas to attract people there and maintain good rural health. Thank you for your attention, and that concludes my presentation.